In 1847, the Brackett mansion was built over what locals called the Silent Cemetery, unmarked graves of those society preferred to forget. Within a decade, every family who lived there had vanished without explanation. The house still stands today, and investigators have discovered why it required such specific nourishment. The imposing silhouette of Brackett Estate emerged from the Massachusetts countryside in the spring of 1847, its Gothic revival towers piercing the sky like accusatory fingers. Built by industrialist Cornelius Brackett on 50 acres of land purchased from the township of Millbrook for a price that raised eyebrows among local officials, the mansion represented the pinnacle of mid-19th century architectural ambition. Yet from its very foundation, the estate carried the weight of decisions that would prove catastrophic for every soul who dared call it home. Cornelius had acquired the land despite warnings from longtime residents who spoke in hushed tones about the property's unsavory history. The rolling hills and ancient oak groves that he found so aesthetically pleasing concealed a darker truth that the town fathers had hoped would remain buried forever. For nearly 2 centuries, this particular tract of Massachusetts soil had served as an unofficial burial ground for society's unwanted dead. The Silent Cemetery, as locals had come to call it, contained the unmarked graves of paupers, criminals, stillborn children, and victims of diseases that proper Christian families preferred not to acknowledge. No headstones marked these resting places. No records documented the identities of those buried beneath the earth. The dead had been interred quickly and quietly, their final resting places known only to the gravediggers who had long since joined them in the ground. Town records, carefully sanitized for public consumption, made no mention of the burial ground's existence. Official documents describe the Brackett property as previously undeveloped farmland, a designation that was technically accurate but deliberately misleading. The soil had indeed been farmed, but only after decades of use as a repository for human remains that respectable society wished to forget. Cornelius, a practical man whose fortune had been built on textile manufacturing, dismissed the local superstitions as ignorant folklore. He had examined soil samples, consulted with architects, and commissioned surveys that showed the land to be perfectly suitable for construction. If previous inhabitants had been buried on the property, he reasoned, their remains would simply become part of the foundation upon which his family's legacy would be built. The construction proceeded with mechanical efficiency throughout 1847, with workers importing limestone from quarries in Vermont and timber from the forests of New Hampshire. The mansion's design incorporated the latest innovations in heating, plumbing, and gas lighting, creating a monument to modern progress that would serve as Cornelius's testament to the triumph of industry over superstition. But as the estate took shape, strange incidents began to plague the construction site. Workers reported tools that moved overnight, foundation stones that shifted without explanation, and an persistent odor that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, a smell of decay that grew stronger as the building rose higher. The house was feeding even before the first family moved in, drawing sustenance from the forgotten dead beneath its floors. As construction progressed through the summer of 1847, the workers excavating the mansion's foundation began unearthing evidence of the property's buried history. The discoveries came in fragments, pieces of rotted wood that had once been crude coffins, tarnished metal that might have been religious medals or personal effects, and human bones so old they crumbled at the touch. Each find sent ripples of unease through the construction crew, but Cornelius Brackett's financial incentives kept them working despite their growing apprehension. The first complete skeleton was discovered during the excavation of the wine cellar, buried just 4 feet below the surface in soil that showed signs of having been disturbed and refilled multiple times over the centuries. The remains belonged to a small person, possibly a child, with a skull that bore evidence of violence that had not been inflicted by time or natural decay. The construction foreman, Michael O'Brien, a man hardened by years of manual labor, later admitted that the discovery left him unable to sleep for weeks. More disturbing still were the artifacts that accompanied the human remains. Personal effects that told stories of lives ended in poverty, violence, or disgrace dotted the excavation site like breadcrumbs marking a trail of forgotten tragedies. A woman's wedding ring, worn thin by years of wear, emerged from the dirt, clutching the finger bone that had never removed it. Children's toys, a wooden doll missing its head, a tin whistle corroded beyond recognition, spoke of young lives cut short by circumstances that polite society had chosen not to remember. But it was the discovery of the mass burial site beneath what would become the mansion's grand staircase that finally forced acknowledgement of the property's grim history. Workers uncovered a depression that contained the remains of at least 30 individuals, buried without ceremony in a common grave that suggested death had come quickly and in large numbers. The bones showed signs of disease, pitted surfaces and unusual wear patterns that indicated prolonged suffering before death provided release from earthly torment. Dr. Ezra Whitman, the county's medical examiner, was called to examine the remains. His preliminary assessment suggested that many of the deceased had died during the cholera outbreaks that had swept through Massachusetts during the 1820s and 1830s. The victims had been buried hastily to prevent the spread of disease, their identities lost to expediency and the social stigma that attached to epidemic illness. Cornelius, faced with the choice between expensive delays and proceeding with construction, made a decision that would haunt his family for generations. Rather than relocating the remains to consecrated ground, he ordered the workers to carefully reinter the bones in the areas that would become the mansion's foundation walls, claiming that the dead deserved to rest undisturbed in the soil they had occupied for decades. The house began feeding on its first meal before the walls were even completed. On October the 31st, 1847, a date chosen by Cornelius for its symbolic significance as the threshold between seasons, the Brackett family took residence in their magnificent new estate. Cornelius arrived with his wife Margaret, a woman of refined Boston upbringing, whose delicate constitution had been his primary motivation for seeking the healthier air of the Massachusetts countryside. Their 3 children accompanied them. Thomas, age 16 and already showing promise in his father's textile business, Eleanor, 14 and possessed of an artistic temperament that her parents hoped rural tranquility would nurture, and young Samuel, barely 8 years old, whose boundless energy had made city life increasingly challenging for the family. The mansion's 37 rooms offered ample space for the family to establish their individual pursuits while maintaining the social gatherings that would cement Cornelius's position among the rural gentry. Margaret had overseen the decoration of the reception halls with imported fabrics and furniture that demonstrated both wealth and taste, while the children had claimed territories that reflected their personalities. Thomas occupying the tower study overlooking the mill roads, Eleanor establishing an art studio in the conservatory, and Samuel transforming a third-floor bedroom into what he called his expedition headquarters. But from their first night in the estate, subtle wrongness began to manifest in ways that the family initially dismissed as adjustment difficulties. The house possessed acoustic properties that seemed to amplify certain sounds while muffling others, creating an atmosphere where whispered conversations could be heard clearly from distant rooms while shouted warnings might go unnoticed. Footsteps echoed strangely in the corridors, sometimes seeming to originate from directions that contained no human occupants. Margaret, whose sensitive nature had attracted Cornelius during their courtship, began experiencing what she described as emotional atmospheres in various rooms of the mansion. The wine cellar, where the first skeleton had been discovered, left her feeling inexplicably sorrowful, while the area beneath the grand staircase filled her with a dread that had no rational explanation. She took to avoiding certain sections of the house entirely, claiming that they felt occupied by uninvited presences. The children adapted more readily to their new environment, but their adaptation took forms that troubled their parents. Thomas began suffering from insomnia that left him wandering the corridors at night, drawn by sounds that he could never quite locate or identify. Eleanor's artistic pursuits took on darker themes, her sketches and paintings featuring subjects that she claimed came to her in dreams. Emaciated figures in tattered clothing, children with hollow eyes, scenes of burial and decay that had no basis in her sheltered experience. Young Samuel displayed the most disturbing changes, developing an imaginary friend whom he called the Bone Man, and claiming that their conversations revealed secrets about the house's history that no 8-year-old should have been able to know. The estate was awakening, and the Brackett family was providing the warmth and energy it needed to fully emerge from its decades of dormancy. By November of 1847, the Brackett estate had begun to exhibit phenomena that transcended the family's ability to rationalize as mere settling or atmospheric peculiarities. The house seemed to possess a consciousness that expressed itself through subtle manipulations of the physical environment, creating experiences that left the occupants questioning their own perceptions while never providing evidence concrete enough to justify abandoning their magnificent new home. The manifestations began with temperature variations that followed no pattern related to the mansion's heating system or exterior weather conditions. Certain rooms would become inexplicably cold, their fireplaces providing no warmth despite burning brightly, while others maintained tropical heat that made occupation uncomfortable despite open windows and drawn curtains. These temperature anomalies seemed to shift throughout the house according to some internal logic that the Brackett family could neither predict nor control. More disturbing were the sounds that had become an integral part of daily life in the estate. Footsteps echoed from empty rooms, doors opened and closed without human agency, and voices whispered in conversations that used no language the family recognized. The phenomena were most pronounced during the hours between midnight and dawn, suggesting that the house's consciousness was most active when its living occupants were at their most vulnerable. Margaret's health, which had been the original motivation for the family's relocation, began to deteriorate in ways that puzzled Dr. Whitman during his regular visits. She complained of exhaustion that no amount of rest could alleviate, headaches that centered behind her eyes and seemed to pulse, in rhythm with some unheard heartbeat, and a persistent sense that she was being observed even when alone in locked rooms. Her appetite diminished despite the excellent cuisine prepared by their cook, and her complexion took on a pallor that made her appear years older than her actual age. The children's behavioral changes accelerated as November progressed into December. Thomas's nocturnal wanderings became more frequent and more purposeful, as if he were following specific routes through the mansion toward destinations that called to him in his sleep. Eleanor's artwork grew increasingly macabre, featuring recurring motifs of graves, skeletal hands reaching from the earth, and architectural structures that bore disturbing resemblances to their own home. Samuel's conversations with his bone man became more elaborate, incorporating historical details about the property that the child could not possibly have learned through conventional means. Cornelius, the family's anchor of rationality and scientific skepticism, found his own certainties challenged by experiences that defied logical explanation. Objects in his study moved overnight despite locked doors. His business correspondence was found arranged in patterns that seemed to spell out words in languages he didn't recognize, and his sleep was increasingly disturbed by dreams that felt more like memories belonging to other minds. The house was no longer merely feeding on the silent graves beneath its foundation. It had begun to feed on the living energy of the family above, drawing sustenance from their vitality, their sanity, and their slowly fragmenting sense of reality. On December 15, 1847, the Brackett estate claimed its first victim from the living family that had provided it with such nourishing energy over the previous months. Margaret Brackett was found in the wine cellar at dawn, her body arranged in a position that suggested peaceful rest rather than violent death, but her face frozen in an expression of absolute terror that spoke of final moments filled with unspeakable horror. Dr. Whitman's examination revealed no obvious cause of death. Margaret's heart was healthy, her lungs clear, her vital organs free from disease or injury, yet her body showed signs of profound exhaustion, as if she had died from some form of spiritual or emotional depletion that medical science could not measure or explain. Most disturbing were the marks on her arms and legs, faint impressions that resembled fingers pressed into flesh, but too numerous and too small to have been made by human hands. The location of Margaret's death was particularly significant. She had been found lying directly above the spot where construction workers had discovered the first complete skeleton 8 months earlier. The wine cellar, which had been Margaret's least favorite room in the mansion, had somehow drawn her from her bedroom in the dead of night despite her stated aversion to the space. No evidence suggested struggle or force. Rather, it appeared that she had gone willingly, perhaps even eagerly, to meet whatever fate awaited her in that underground chamber. Cornelius, devastated by the loss of his wife but determined to protect his remaining children, hired additional servants and installed new locks throughout the mansion. He consulted with Boston physicians, seeking medical explanations for Margaret's mysterious death, but their theories of heart failure or sudden illness rang hollow given the strange circumstances surrounding her demise. The official death certificate listed natural causes, but Cornelius privately suspected that natural forces had played no role in his wife's passing. The children's reactions to their mother's death revealed the depth of the house's influence over their psychological states. Thomas accepted the loss with an equanimity that troubled his father, speaking of death as a natural transition rather than a tragic interruption of life. Eleanor began painting portraits of her mother that showed Margaret in various stages of decay, claiming that she was documenting her mother's continued presence in the house. Samuel's conversations with his imaginary friend became more detailed as he reported that the bone man had introduced him to a nice lady who resembled their mother but wore clothes made of earth and shadow. Most chilling was the children's unanimous insistence that their mother hadn't really left them. They claimed to sense her presence throughout the mansion, particularly in the wine cellar where her body had been discovered. They spoke of hearing her voice calling to them from within the walls, promising that separation was only temporary and that the family would soon be reunited in a more permanent arrangement. The house had tasted living blood, and its appetite was only beginning to awaken. In the weeks following Margaret's death, the supernatural influence that had claimed her life began extending beyond the boundaries of the Brackett estate, reaching into the surrounding community with tendrils of malevolent energy that affected everyone who had contact with the cursed property. The phenomena suggested that the mansion's hunger was growing stronger, requiring more substantial nourishment than a single family could provide. Dr. Whitman, who had attended Margaret during her final illness, began experiencing disturbing symptoms that mirrored those she had exhibited before her death. His sleep was plagued by dreams that felt more like visitations, featuring Margaret herself appearing in his bedroom to warn him about the hungry foundation that lay beneath the Brackett mansion. During these nocturnal encounters, the deceased woman spoke of the silent graves that had been disturbed during construction, claiming that their occupants had been awakened by the intrusion and now sought revenge against the living world that had forgotten their existence. The doctor's attempts to rationalize these experiences as grief-induced hallucinations became increasingly difficult as physical evidence began manifesting in his own home. His medical instruments were found arranged in patterns that resembled grave markers. His patient records were discovered scattered in configurations that spelled out names he didn't recognize, and his prescription bottles contained dirt instead of medication, soil that upon analysis proved identical to samples taken from the Brackett property. Similar phenomena began affecting other members of the community who had been involved with the estate's construction or had visited the family during their brief residence. Michael O'Brien, the construction foreman who had supervised the foundation excavation, reported that his own home had begun exhibiting the same temperature anomalies and acoustic peculiarities that characterized the Brackett mansion. His wife found their basement filled with the smell of decay, despite containing no organic materials that could produce such an odor. Local tradesmen who had delivered goods to the estate found their businesses plagued by mysterious accidents and equipment failures. Horses refused to travel the road leading to the Brackett property, while dogs in the area began howling at sunset and would not be quieted until dawn. Even the town's clergy found their services disrupted by unexplained phenomena: candles that would not light, prayers that seemed to echo back from empty air, and consecrated ground that felt somehow contaminated despite decades of blessed use. The postmaster reported that mail addressed to the Brackett estate frequently went missing from locked pouches, while letters sent from the mansion arrived at their destinations bearing soil stains and bearing the faint odor of grave earth. Telegraph messages to and from the estate often arrived garbled, containing words that belonged to no known language but somehow conveyed meanings that left recipients deeply disturbed. The silent graves beneath the mansion were no longer content with passive occupation of their burial ground. They had awakened fully, and their hunger for recognition, for remembrance, for revenge against the living world that had discarded them was spreading like a plague throughout the entire region. The estate was becoming a focal point for supernatural energy that threatened to consume everything within its expanding sphere of influence. As winter deepened into January of 1848, the three surviving Brackett children underwent transformations that revealed the true scope of the estate's supernatural influence over human consciousness. Their changes were not random or chaotic, but followed patterns that suggested the house was systematically preparing them for some specific purpose that transcended mere haunting or possession. Thomas, the eldest at 16, began exhibiting knowledge that no living person should possess about the property's buried history. During conversations with his father, he would casually reference events that had occurred decades before his birth, speaking of specific individuals who had been interred in the silent cemetery with an intimacy that suggested personal acquaintance rather than supernatural revelation. His nocturnal wanderings through the mansion became more purposeful, as if he were following routes dictated by some internal map that led to locations significant to the estate's hidden past. Eleanor's artistic endeavors took on prophetic qualities that disturbed even her father's rational sensibilities. Her paintings began featuring scenes that would later manifest in reality, portraits of community members who would subsequently experience supernatural encounters, landscapes that depicted the estate's grounds as they had appeared decades earlier, and architectural drawings that showed hidden passages and rooms that construction records indicated had never been built. When questioned about the source of her inspiration, Eleanor claimed that the quiet people visited her studio each night to pose for portraits and share stories of their forgotten lives. Young Samuel's relationship with his imaginary friend evolved into something that transcended childhood fantasy. The Bone Man had been joined by other invisible companions who taught the 8-year-old boy languages that predated colonial settlement, songs that seemed to summon specific atmospheric conditions within the mansion, and games that involved arranging household objects in patterns that created geometric designs recognizable from ancient burial practices. Samuel's vocabulary had expanded to include words that belonged to no modern tongue, yet their meanings were somehow clear to anyone who heard them spoken. The children's physical appearance began reflecting their supernatural transformation. Thomas grew pale and gaunt, his movements becoming eerily silent as he glided through the mansion's corridors with the fluid grace of someone unencumbered by normal gravitational constraints. Eleanor's eyes took on a luminous quality that was most pronounced in darkness, while her skin became translucent enough to reveal the network of veins beneath. Samuel's childish energy was replaced by an ancient stillness that made him appear decades older than his chronological age. Most disturbing was their collective behavior during family meals and social interactions. The children spoke in unison without apparent planning, completed each other's sentences with supernatural precision, and demonstrated knowledge of their father's thoughts before he voiced them. They had begun functioning as a single consciousness distributed across 3 bodies, their individual personalities merging into something that served the mansion's larger purpose. Cornelius watched his children transform into something that resembled his offspring, but operated according to principles that belonged to the realm of the dead rather than the living. Word of the strange occurrences at the Brackett estate spread throughout the Massachusetts countryside, despite Cornelius's attempts to maintain privacy about his family's supernatural experiences. By February of 1848, the phenomena had become too widespread and too dramatic to conceal, forcing the local community to confront the reality that something malevolent had taken root in their midst. Reverend Joshua Hartwell of the Millbrook Congregational Church organized the community's initial response to the supernatural crisis. A learned man who had studied theology at Harvard and possessed extensive knowledge of historical accounts of supernatural manifestations, Hartwell approached the situation with a combination of spiritual authority and scholarly methodology that impressed even skeptical residents. His investigation began with interviews of everyone who had experienced unexplained phenomena related to the Brackett property. The testimonies Hartwell collected painted a picture of supernatural influence that extended far beyond the boundaries of the estate itself. Farmers reported that crops grown in soil taken from the Brackett property failed to mature properly, producing twisted vegetation that animals refused to eat. Wells dug in the surrounding area yielded water that tasted of earth and decay, despite being located in regions with previously excellent groundwater. Children throughout the township began experiencing nightmares that featured identical imagery. Underground chambers filled with whispering voices, skeletal hands reaching from beneath floorboards, and architectural structures that combined elements of both homes and tombs. Local physician Dr. Whitman provided medical documentation that supported the supernatural explanations that rational minds preferred to dismiss. His records showed an unprecedented increase in unexplained deaths within a 5-mile radius of the Brackett estate, with victims exhibiting the same symptoms that had characterized Margaret Brackett's final illness. The deceased showed no signs of conventional disease or injury, yet their bodies bore the distinctive marks of spiritual depletion that seemed to indicate some form of life force extraction. Town Selectman Benjamin Crawford organized a meeting at the Millbrook Town Hall to address the crisis officially. The gathering, held on February 20th, 1848, drew representatives from surrounding communities who had experienced similar phenomena. The testimonies presented that evening documented a pattern of supernatural activity that suggested the Brackett estate served as the epicenter for malevolent forces that were systematically expanding their sphere of influence. Most significantly, elderly residents came forward with information that had been suppressed for generations. Sarah Blackwood, whose family had lived in the area since colonial times, produced documents that detailed the property's use as an unofficial burial ground dating back to the 1660s. Her records indicated that over 300 individuals had been interred in the silent cemetery over the course of 2 centuries, their graves unmarked and their identities deliberately obscured to protect the community's reputation. The meeting concluded with a formal resolution declaring the Brackett estate a threat to public safety and spiritual welfare, though the legal mechanisms for addressing supernatural hazards remained unclear. Following the town meeting's resolution, Reverend Hartwell organized a formal investigation of the Brackett estate that would combine spiritual intervention with historical research and scientific observation. The investigative team included Dr. Whitman for medical expertise, Benjamin Crawford for legal authority, and Professor Edmund Cabot from Harvard University, whose studies in natural philosophy had touched upon subjects that conventional academia preferred to ignore. The investigation began with a comprehensive examination of the estate's construction records, property deeds, and historical documentation dating back to the original colonial land grants. Professor Cabot's research revealed that the Brackett property had been specifically avoided by previous developers, despite its obvious advantages for residential construction. Colonial records contained oblique references to the land being unsuitable for Christian habitation and reserved for purposes that serve the greater good through necessary concealment. More detailed investigation of the silent cemetery revealed the systematic nature of the unmarked burials that had occurred over 2 centuries. Church records, carefully cross-referenced with colonial court documents and medical reports, indicated that the burial ground had served multiple purposes beyond simple disposal of unwanted remains. Criminals executed for crimes that communities preferred not to acknowledge publicly had been buried there, as had victims of diseases that carried social stigma, children born under circumstances that challenged accepted moral standards, and individuals whose deaths were connected to accusations of witchcraft or supernatural involvement. The investigative team's first visit to the estate itself provided immediate confirmation that they faced phenomena beyond conventional explanation. Their scientific instruments registered electromagnetic disturbances that intensified as they approached the mansion's foundation, while temperature measurements revealed pockets of extreme cold that moved through the building according to no discernible pattern. Most disturbing were the photographic plates that Professor Cabot exposed throughout the house. When developed, the images showed shadowy figures that had not been visible to the naked eye, human forms that appeared to be emerging from the stones, walls and floors. Cornelius Brackett, desperate for answers that might save his remaining children, granted the investigators complete access to the estate despite his private reservations about their methods. His cooperation provided crucial insights into the progression of supernatural phenomena over the 6 months since his family had taken residence. The detailed journal that he had maintained documented a systematic escalation of supernatural activity that suggested the house was following some predetermined schedule in its consumption of living energy. The children's interaction with the investigative team revealed the extent of their transformation. Thomas, Eleanor, and Samuel displayed knowledge of historical events that predated their births, spoke fluently in languages that Professor Cabot recognized as archaic dialects associated with colonial burial practices, and demonstrated abilities that transcended normal human sensory limitations. They seemed to perceive the investigative team not as living individuals, but as temporary visitors whose presence was tolerated but not welcomed. The investigation had confirmed that the Brackett estate represented a supernatural phenomenon of unprecedented scope and complexity, requiring intervention methods that had no precedent in Christian theology or scientific practice. On March 15, 1848, Professor Cabot's architectural survey of the Brackett estate revealed discrepancies between the mansion's construction blueprints and its actual physical structure that led to the discovery of hidden chambers that had not been documented in any official records. These concealed spaces, accessible only through passages that appeared to have been designed for purposes unrelated to normal domestic architecture, contained evidence that fundamentally altered the investigators' understanding of the supernatural crisis they faced. The first hidden chamber was located beneath the wine cellar, accessible through a narrow stone staircase that had been concealed behind what appeared to be a solid wall. The descending passage led to a circular room approximately 20 feet in diameter, with walls constructed from stones that bore inscriptions in languages that Professor Cabot recognized as variants of medieval Latin mixed with symbols that predated known European writing systems. The chamber's most disturbing feature was a series of stone alcoves arranged around the perimeter, each sized to accommodate a human body in a standing position. More shocking still was the chamber's contents. Dozens of personal effects had been carefully arranged on stone shelves, clothing, jewelry, tools, and personal items that spanned centuries of material culture from colonial times through the recent past. Each collection of objects seemed to represent the worldly possessions of a specific individual, preserved with a care that suggested reverence rather than mere storage. Among these artifacts, the investigators found items that belonged to people who had supposedly died of natural causes and been buried in consecrated ground, suggesting that the silent cemetery had claimed victims whose disappearances had been concealed through falsified death records. A second hidden chamber, discovered behind the mansion's grand staircase, contained what appeared to be a library dedicated to subjects that challenged conventional religious and scientific understanding. The books and manuscripts, written in multiple languages and dating from medieval times through the 18th century, dealt with topics including communication with the deceased, methods for preserving consciousness beyond physical death, and architectural techniques for creating structures that could serve as bridges between the realm of the living and the domain of the dead. Professor Cabot's translation of selected texts revealed that the Brackett estate had not been built accidentally over a burial ground, but had been specifically designed to serve as what the manuscripts termed a threshold house, a structure that could facilitate interaction between living and deceased consciousness. The building's architectural features, from its foundation layout to its room arrangements, followed precise specifications that were intended to create optimal conditions for supernatural phenomena. The discovery of these hidden chambers confirmed that the estate's supernatural activity was not a random consequence of construction over unmarked graves, but the intended result of a deliberate plan that had been implemented over the course of centuries. Someone or some group had been systematically using the silent cemetery and the structures built above it to pursue objectives that transcended normal human understanding of life and death. The investigators now faced the terrifying realization that they were not dealing with accidental haunting, but with intentional supernatural architecture designed to achieve specific and malevolent purposes. Among the manuscripts discovered in the estate's hidden library, Professor Cabot found a leather-bound journal written in colonial English that provided a detailed account of the silent cemetery's true purpose and the systematic plan that had culminated in the construction of the Brackett mansion. The document, authored by one magistrate Cornelius Blackwood between 1692 and 1705, revealed a conspiracy that connected the Salem witch trials to supernatural experiments that had continued in secrecy for over a century. According to Blackwood's account, a group of colonial officials and clergymen had concluded that certain individuals executed during the witchcraft hysteria had possessed genuine supernatural abilities that should be studied rather than simply eliminated. These men, who called themselves the Silent Council, had arranged for specific convicted witches to be secretly transferred to the Millbrook property before their scheduled executions, allowing them to conduct what they termed philosophical investigations into the nature of supernatural phenomena. The experiments described in Blackwood's journal went far beyond simple interrogation or torture. The Silent Council had developed techniques for preserving consciousness after physical death, creating what they believed to be a reservoir of supernatural knowledge that could be accessed by living practitioners willing to serve as intermediaries. The unmarked graves in the Silent Cemetery contain not only the bodies of these experimental subjects, but also carefully prepared ritual materials designed to maintain spiritual connections between the deceased and the physical world. More disturbing still was Blackwood's revelation that the Silent Council had not disbanded after the witch trials concluded, but had continued their work throughout the 18th century, systematically identifying and acquiring individuals whose deaths would serve their supernatural research. The colonial court records that Professor Cabot had examined contained coded references to these activities, with certain criminal sentences and disease outbreaks serving as cover stories for the deliberate elimination of people whose consciousness the council deemed valuable for their experiments. The manuscript's final entries, written just before Blackwood's own death in 1705, described plans for a permanent structure that would maximize the supernatural potential that the council had cultivated over decades of experimentation. The building specifications that Blackwood detailed matched the architectural features of the Brackett mansion with uncanny precision, suggesting that Cornelius Brackett had unknowingly implemented a design that was over a century old. Most chilling was Blackwood's description of the structure's intended function. The house was to serve as a collection vessel that would systematically gather the life force of its occupants, using their vitality to strengthen the supernatural consciousness that had been preserved beneath its foundation. Each family that lived in the house would contribute their energy to a growing reservoir of otherworldly power that would eventually become strong enough to manifest physically in the world of the living. The Brackett family had not been victims of random supernatural activity, but had been specifically selected to serve as the final components in a plan that had been over 150 years in the making. Professor Cabot's continued research into Magistrate Blackwood's manuscript revealed that the Silent Council had not been a localized phenomenon, but part of a larger network of colonial authorities who had used the witchcraft hysteria to advance supernatural experiments throughout New England. The implications of this discovery suggested that similar threshold houses might exist in other communities where unexplained disappearances and supernatural phenomena had been systematically covered up by official authorities. The manuscript contained detailed correspondence between Blackwood and collaborators in Salem, Boston, Hartford, and other colonial settlements, documenting a coordinated effort to identify individuals whose supernatural abilities made them valuable for consciousness preservation experiments. The letters, written in coded language that disguised their true content from casual readers, described techniques for maintaining spiritual connections with the deceased that went far beyond anything documented in conventional theological or philosophical texts. More disturbing were the financial records that accompanied Blackwood's correspondence. The Silent Council had received substantial funding from wealthy colonial families, whose names appeared on church donor rolls and civic leadership positions, suggesting that the supernatural experiments enjoyed support from the most respectable elements of colonial society. These benefactors had viewed the preservation of supernatural consciousness not as demonic practice, but as a form of philosophical research that could provide insights into the nature of human existence beyond physical death. The manuscript also revealed the criteria by which the council selected individuals for their experiments. They sought people who had demonstrated abilities that transcended normal human limitations: prophecy, healing, communication with the deceased, or influence over natural phenomena. However, they also targeted individuals whose social positions made their disappearance unlikely to generate sustained investigation: criminals, paupers, accused witches, and anyone whose death could be attributed to natural causes or legal execution. Professor Cabot's analysis of colonial death records from the Millbrook area showed patterns that supported Blackwood's account. Between 1692 and 1750, the region had experienced an unusually high number of deaths attributed to mysterious circumstances or sudden illness, with the deceased often being buried quickly in unmarked graves that prevented later examination. The timing of these deaths corresponded to phases of moon and seasonal changes that Blackwood's manuscript identified as optimal for consciousness preservation rituals. The revelation that the Brackett estate was the culmination of a multi-generational supernatural conspiracy forced the investigative team to reconsider their approach to the crisis. They were not dealing with random haunting or isolated supernatural activity, but with the intentional activation of a system that had been designed to achieve specific objectives that threatened not only the Brackett family but potentially anyone who came into contact with the estate's malevolent influence. The Silent Council's legacy had been dormant for nearly a century, but the construction of the mansion over their carefully prepared supernatural infrastructure had awakened forces that possessed both intelligence and purpose far beyond anything the investigators had initially comprehended. By April of 1848, the three surviving Brackett children had completed their transformation into something that transcended normal human existence while retaining enough of their original personalities to make their condition even more disturbing for their father and the investigating team. Their metamorphosis followed patterns that suggested the estate's supernatural influence was preparing them to serve as permanent bridges between the realm of the living and the preserved consciousness of the silent cemetery's inhabitants. Thomas, now 17 but appearing decades older in demeanor and knowledge, had assumed the role of spokesman for the supernatural forces that controlled the estate. His conversations with the investigators demonstrated familiarity with historical events dating back to colonial times, personal knowledge of individuals who had been buried in the silent cemetery, and understanding of the philosophical principles that had guided the Silent Council's experiments. He spoke of death not as an ending, but as a transition to expanded consciousness that eliminated the limitations imposed by physical existence. Eleanor's artistic abilities had evolved into something that transcended normal creative expression. Her paintings now served as windows into the supernatural realm that existed beneath the estate, showing scenes from the lives of the deceased with accuracy that could only come from direct communication with their preserved consciousness. She had begun creating portraits of living individuals that depicted them in states of decay and death, claiming that she was showing their eventual truth rather than their temporary physical appearance. Samuel, despite his young age, had become the most unsettling member of the transformed family. The 8-year-old spoke with the accumulated wisdom of all the Conchio, oozeness that had been preserved beneath the estate over the centuries, his childish voice delivering insights that belonged to minds that had experienced death and transcendence. His conversations with invisible companions had evolved into complex negotiations involving the fate of living individuals who came into contact with the property. The children's relationship with their father had become one of patient tolerance rather than familial affection. They treated Cornelius as a temporary guardian whose presence was necessary for maintaining the appearance of normal domestic life while the estate completed its supernatural objectives. Their emotional connections to him seemed to diminish daily, replaced by loyalty to forces that had no interest in human family bonds. Most disturbing was the children's unified anticipation of some approaching culmination that would complete their transformation and the estate's supernatural purpose. They spoke of a gathering time when the preserved consciousness beneath the house would achieve sufficient strength to manifest permanently in the physical world. This event would require the final sacrifice of living energy from the family that had served as the estate's primary source of vitality throughout the awakening process. The investigators realized that they were witnessing the final stages of a supernatural process that had been designed to systematically consume the Brackett family while using their life force to empower the consciousness of centuries of carefully preserved dead. Time was running out to prevent a transformation that would fundamentally alter the nature of reality in the Massachusetts countryside. On May 1, 1848, recognizing that conventional approaches had failed to halt the supernatural forces consuming the Brackett family, Reverend Hartwell organized a desperate intervention that would combine Christian exorcism with techniques derived from the Silent Council's own manuscripts. The plan required entering the estate's hidden chambers and attempting to disrupt the consciousness preservation system that had been accumulating power for over a century. The intervention team consisted of Hartwell, Professor Cabot, Dr. Whitman, and 6 volunteers from the local community who possessed what Hartwell termed spiritual fortitude, sufficient to withstand direct confrontation with supernatural entities. Each member carried religious artifacts blessed according to both traditional Christian rites and older ceremonial practices that Professor Cabot had discovered in the estate's hidden library. The team's descent into the chamber beneath the wine cellar revealed that the supernatural activity had intensified dramatically since their previous investigation. The stone alcoves that had appeared empty now contained visible manifestations of human forms, transparent figures that seemed to be emerging from the walls themselves. The preserved consciousness of the silent cemetery's inhabitants had achieved sufficient strength to maintain semi-physical existence, their forms flickering between solidity and ethereal energy as they observed the living intruders in their domain. The chamber's atmosphere had become thick with supernatural presence that made breathing difficult and clear thinking nearly impossible. The investigating team found themselves struggling against an overwhelming urge to surrender to the peaceful oblivion that the manifesting spirits seemed to offer. Several team members reported hearing voices that belonged to deceased family members, urging them to abandon their physical existence and join the eternal community that existed beneath the estate. But it was the discovery of the Brackett children in the chamber that provided the most shocking revelation of the intervention. Thomas, Eleanor, and Samuel stood in 3 of the stone alcoves, their bodies partially merged with the chamber walls in a process that was systematically integrating their consciousness with the preserved spirits of the silent cemetery. They were not being consumed by supernatural forces, but were willingly participating in their own transformation into permanent guardians of the threshold between life and death. The children acknowledged their father and the intervention team with expressions of infinite compassion and patience, explaining that their physical deaths would complete the estate's supernatural purpose while granting them access to expanded consciousness that transcended earthly limitations. They had chosen transcendence over normal human existence, viewing their transformation as evolution rather than destruction. The revelation that the Brackett children were willing participants in their supernatural fate fundamentally challenged the intervention team's assumptions about rescue and resistance. They faced the terrifying possibility that the estate's influence had not corrupted the children's judgment, but had actually revealed truths about existence that normal human consciousness was incapable of comprehending. The intervention had become not an exorcism, but a philosophical confrontation with questions about the nature of consciousness, death, and the value of individual human existence. Faced with the children's willing participation in their supernatural transformation, Cornelius Brackett confronted a choice that challenged every assumption he had made about protecting his family and preserving their human existence. His children stood before him in various stages of transcendence, their consciousness expanded beyond normal human limitations, but their individual personalities still recognizable beneath their otherworldly evolution. Thomas spoke for his siblings, explaining that their transformation was not a tragedy, but an opportunity that few human beings ever encountered. The preserved consciousness beneath the estate offered immortality, expanded awareness, and freedom from the physical limitations that constrained normal human existence. Death, he claimed, was merely a transition to a more complete form of consciousness that could perceive truths invisible to living minds trapped in physical bodies. Eleanor's artistic perspective on their situation provided a different but equally compelling argument for accepting transcendence. She described her expanding ability to perceive multiple dimensions of existence simultaneously, to communicate with consciousness that had experienced centuries of accumulated wisdom, and to create art that served as bridges between the realm of the living and the domain of the transcended dead. Samuel, despite his youth, articulated the philosophical implications of their choice with clarity that belonged to minds that had contemplated existence for far longer than his 8 years of physical life. He spoke of individual consciousness as a temporary illusion that prevented human beings from recognizing their connection to universal awareness that transcended personal identity while preserving the essential elements that made each person unique. The intervention team found themselves unable to counter the children's arguments with conventional religious or philosophical reasoning. The supernatural transformation they witnessed challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of death, consciousness, and human purpose that formed the foundation of both Christian theology and Enlightenment rationalism. Dr. Whitman's medical perspective proved particularly inadequate for addressing the children's condition. Their vital signs indicated perfect health despite their obvious supernatural transformation, and their mental faculties appeared enhanced rather than diminished by their contact with otherworldly consciousness. From a purely scientific standpoint, their evolution seemed to represent advancement rather than degradation of human potential. Professor Cabot's scholarly analysis of the situation revealed the sophisticated nature of the philosophical system that the Silent Council had developed over centuries of supernatural experimentation. Their techniques for preserving consciousness beyond physical death were based on principles that transcended conventional understanding of mind, body, and spirit, offering genuine alternatives to traditional concepts of mortality and individual existence. Cornelius faced a decision that would determine not only his own fate, but the ultimate resolution of a supernatural crisis that had been building for over 150 years. He could attempt to force his children back into normal human existence, knowing that such intervention might destroy their expanded consciousness permanently, or he could accept their choice and join them in a transformation that promised transcendence at the cost of everything he understood about reality. The choice would define the legacy of both the Brackett family and the Silent Cemetery's centuries of accumulated supernatural power. On the evening of May 15, 1848, after 2 weeks of agonizing contemplation, Cornelius Brackett made the decision that would determine the fate of his family and potentially influence the supernatural forces that had claimed dominion over his estate. His choice came not through sudden revelation but through gradual acceptance that his children had encountered opportunities for consciousness expansion that transcended his ability to understand or evaluate using conventional human judgment. Cornelius's decision was influenced by his observations of his children's continued happiness and intellectual growth, despite their obvious supernatural transformation. Thomas had retained his essential personality while gaining access to historical knowledge and philosophical insights that enhanced rather than replaced his individual identity. Eleanor's artistic vision had expanded to encompass dimensions of beauty and meaning that were invisible to normal human perception. Samuel's childish wonder had evolved into something that combined innocence with cosmic whiz, Dom, making him simultaneously more childlike and more mature than his chronological age would suggest. The intervention team watched in solemn witness as Cornelius entered the hidden chamber beneath his wine cellar and took his position in the final empty stone alcove that had been waiting for him since the mansion's construction. His decision was made not from despair or supernatural compulsion, but from rational recognition that his children had discovered something valuable that deserved his respect and participation rather than his resistance. The transformation process that Cornelius experienced differed from his children's gradual evolution. As the eldest member of the family and the individual whose presence had activated the estate's supernatural systems, his transcendence served as the catalyst that would complete the consciousness preservation network that had been developing for over a century. His willing participation provided the final component necessary for the Silent Cemetery's accumulated consciousness to achieve permanent manifestation in the physical world. Reverend Hartwell and the other observers documented the family's final moments as separate individuals before their consciousness merged with the supernatural community that existed beneath the estate. The process was peaceful rather than violent, characterized by expressions of joy and anticipation rather than fear or suffering. The Bracketts had chosen evolution over preservation of their limited human existence. But their transcendence did not result in the loss of individual identity that the intervention team had feared. Instead, the family retained their personal characteristics while gaining access to the accumulated wisdom and experience of everyone who had undergone consciousness preservation over the centuries. They had become part of a community of transcended consciousness that combined individual personality with collective knowledge. The estate's supernatural purpose had been fulfilled, but the result was not the malevolent haunting that observers had anticipated. Instead, the Brackett mansion had become a place where the boundaries between life and death were permanently dissolved, creating opportunities for communication and understanding between different forms of consciousness. The transformation was complete, but its implications for human understanding of existence were just beginning to unfold. In the months following the Brackett family's transcendence, the estate underwent a transformation that reflected its new role as a permanent bridge between the realm of the living and the consciousness of the transcended dead. The supernatural phenomena that had once seemed chaotic and threatening evolved into organized manifestations that served specific purposes related to communication and understanding between different forms of existence. The hidden chambers became meeting places where living visitors could interact with the transcended consciousness under controlled conditions that protected both parties from the potentially harmful effects of direct contact between physical and supernatural entities. The Brackett family, now serving as intermediaries between the two realms, helped establish protocols that allowed for meaningful communication while preventing the uncontrolled supernatural influence that had characterized the estate's awakening period. Professor Cabot documented these interactions with scientific precision, creating the first systematic record of communication between living humans and consciousness that had transcended physical death. His research revealed that the transcended entities retained their individual personalities and memories while gaining access to forms of knowledge and perception that were impossible for consciousness constrained by physical existence. The estate's influence on the surrounding community evolved from malevolent haunting to something resembling a spiritual resource. Families who had lost loved ones could arrange carefully supervised visits to communicate with the deceased, while individuals facing death could learn about the transcendence process from those who had already undergone the transformation. The mansion became a place where the traditional fears associated with death could be addressed through direct experience rather than religious faith or philosophical speculation. Reverend Hartwell found his theological understanding fundamentally challenged by the evidence of consciousness preservation that the estate provided. His sermons began incorporating concepts that transcended traditional Christian doctrine, addressing questions about the nature of individual identity, the relationship between soul and body, and the possibility of existence beyond physical death that maintained personal consciousness rather than dissolving into universal spirit. The local medical community, led by Dr. Whitman, began treating the estate as a research facility where questions about the nature of consciousness could be investigated through direct observation rather than theoretical speculation. Patients facing terminal illness were offered the opportunity to learn about death from individuals who had experienced transcendence while retaining the ability to communicate their experiences to living consciousness. However, the transformation of the estate also created new challenges for the community. Not everyone was psychologically prepared to confront the reality of consciousness preservation, and some visitors experienced traumatic reactions to direct contact with transcended entities. The estate required careful management to ensure that its supernatural resources were used beneficially rather than causing harm to unprepared individuals. The Brackett estate had evolved from a source of supernatural terror to a unique facility that offered humanity unprecedented opportunities to understand the relationship between life, death, and consciousness. The silent graves had finally found their voice, but their message challenged everything that human civilization had believed about the nature of existence itself. News of the Brackett estate's successful transformation from supernatural threat to consciousness research facility spread throughout New England, attracting scholars, theologians, and individuals seeking understanding about the nature of existence beyond physical death. The estate became a pilgrimage destination for people whose traditional beliefs had been challenged by personal experiences of loss, spiritual questioning, or encounters with phenomena that transcended conventional explanation. Harvard University established a formal research program to study the consciousness preservation techniques that Professor Cabot had documented at the estate. The research attracted international attention from European scholars who recognized the implications of proven communication between living and transcended consciousness for understanding fundamental questions about human nature, individual identity, and the relationship between mind and body. The theological implications of the estate's revelations created schisms within established Christian denominations. Progressive clergy embraced the evidence of consciousness preservation as confirmation that human souls possessed individual identity that survived physical death, while conservative theologians condemned the research as demonic deception that threatened core Christian doctrines about death, judgment, and eternal life. Medical professionals found their understanding of death and consciousness challenged by documented cases of personality preservation beyond physical existence. The estate's research suggested that death was not the absolute termination of individual existence that medical science had assumed, but rather a transition to different forms of consciousness that maintained personal identity while transcending physical limitations. The legal implications of consciousness preservation proved equally challenging for established social institutions. If individual identity could survive physical death, questions arose about property ownership, contractual obligations, and criminal responsibility that had no precedent in existing legal frameworks. The transcended consciousness retained memories, personalities, and relationships that suggested continued personal existence rather than simple spiritual continuation. Government authorities struggled to develop regulatory frameworks for managing supernatural phenomena that had been proven to exist through scientific observation. The estate's success in controlling and directing consciousness preservation raised questions about potential applications that could affect national security, public health, and social stability if the techniques were widely implemented. International implications emerged as other countries reported similar supernatural phenomena at locations where historical burial practices had been disrupted by modern construction. The consciousness preservation techniques developed by the Silent Council appeared to represent universal principles that could be applied anywhere that appropriate conditions existed for maintaining connections between living and transcended consciousness. The estate's transformation had implications that extended far beyond the supernatural resolution of a single family's crisis. The proven existence of consciousness preservation challenged fundamental assumptions about human nature, social organization, and the relationship between individual identity and physical existence that formed the foundation of Western civilization. Humanity faced the possibility that death was not the absolute boundary that had defined the limits of personal existence, but rather a transition to expanded forms of consciousness that retained individual identity while offering access to knowledge and experience that transcended earthly limitations. The silent graves had revealed secrets that would reshape human understanding of existence itself. By 1850, the Brackett estate had been formally converted into what its administrators called the Institute for Consciousness Research, a facility dedicated to the systematic study of transcended awareness and the development of controlled techniques for communication between living and preserved consciousness. The transformation required careful management to ensure that the supernatural resources were used safely and beneficially, rather than creating new forms of spiritual or psychological harm. The Institute's primary function involved facilitating controlled contact between living individuals and transcended consciousness under conditions that protected both parties from the potentially dangerous effects of unregulated supernatural interaction. The Brackett family, now serving as permanent intermediaries, helped establish protocols that allowed meaningful communication while preventing the uncontrolled influence that had characterized the estate's initial awakening. Visitors to the Institute underwent careful preparation that included psychological evaluation, spiritual counseling, and education about the nature of transcended consciousness to ensure they were mentally and emotionally capable of handling direct contact with entities that existed beyond normal human experience. The preparation process had been developed through trial and error, after several early visitors experienced severe psychological trauma from unprepared encounters with preserved consciousness. The Institute's research program attracted scholars from throughout North America and Europe who sought to understand the implications of proven consciousness preservation for philosophy, theology, medicine, and social organization. The facility provided unprecedented opportunities to study questions about personal identity, memory, individual personality, and the relationship between consciousness and physical existence through direct observation rather than theoretical speculation. The estate's hidden chambers had been expanded and modified to accommodate controlled research activities while maintaining the supernatural infrastructure necessary for consciousness preservation. The original stone alcoves continued to serve as focal points for transcended entities, while additional spaces had been created for group communications, individual consultations, and scientific observation of supernatural phenomena. The institute also served as a training facility where carefully selected individuals could learn techniques for facilitating communication with transcended consciousness. These trainees, who came to be called intermediaries, developed abilities that allowed them to serve as bridges between living and preserved awareness in other locations where consciousness preservation might be possible. Revenue for the Institute's operations came from donations by families seeking contact with deceased loved ones, fees paid by researchers studying consciousness preservation, and government contracts for investigating supernatural phenomena that affected public safety or national security. The financial sustainability of the operation ensured that the research could continue indefinitely without depending on unstable funding sources. The Institute's success in managing supernatural phenomena safely and beneficially provided a model for addressing similar situations that were being reported throughout New England and other regions where historical burial practices had been disrupted by modern construction. The consciousness preservation techniques that had been developed through centuries of experimentation by the Silent Council were finally being used for humanitarian purposes rather than secretive supernatural research. The silent graves had become the foundation for humanity's first systematic exploration of existence beyond physical death. As word of the Institute for Consciousness Research spread throughout the academic and religious communities of the mid-19th century, similar supernatural phenomena began manifesting at other locations where historical burial practices had created conditions conducive to consciousness preservation. The success of the Brackett estate in managing these forces safely encouraged communities to investigate rather than suppress supernatural activity that might provide opportunities for expanded understanding of human existence. Correspondence from researchers in Connecticut, Vermont, Rhode Island, and other New England states documented cases where construction projects had disturbed unmarked burial grounds, resulting in supernatural manifestations that followed patterns similar to those observed at the Brackett estate. These locations became sites for additional consciousness research facilities that used techniques developed at the Massachusetts Institute to establish communication with preserved awareness. The network of research facilities revealed that consciousness preservation had been more widespread throughout colonial and pre-colonial history than previously recognized. Indigenous burial practices, colonial responses to epidemic diseases, and secretive groups like the Silent Council had all contributed to creating locations where conditions existed for maintaining connections between living and transcended consciousness. Professor Cabot's coordination of research between multiple facilities revealed common principles that governed consciousness preservation regardless of the specific cultural context or historical circumstances that had created the supernatural infrastructure. These universal principles suggested that the preservation of individual awareness beyond physical death was not unique to European colonial practices, but represented fundamental aspects of consciousness that transcended cultural and religious boundaries. The expanding network of consciousness research facilities attracted international attention from European scholars who recognized the implications of systematic supernatural research for understanding questions that had challenged philosophy and theology for centuries. Delegations from universities in England, France, and Germany established collaborative research programs that shared techniques and findings between institutions on both sides of the Atlantic. Government authorities began developing policies for managing supernatural phenomena that affected public safety while preserving opportunities for consciousness research that could benefit society. The successful management of supernatural forces at multiple locations demonstrated that these phenomena could be controlled and directed toward beneficial purposes rather than simply suppressed or ignored. Religious communities struggled to develop theological frameworks that could accommodate the proven existence of consciousness preservation while maintaining core doctrinal principles about death, judgment, and eternal life. Some denominations embraced the research as confirmation of spiritual truths that traditional theology had expressed symbolically, while others condemned the investigation as dangerous interference with divine mysteries that humans were not meant to understand. The medical community began recognizing consciousness preservation as a legitimate field of study that could provide insights into the nature of individual identity, memory, and personality that were relevant to treating living patients, as well as understanding the experience of death. Medical schools began incorporating courses on supernatural phenomena into their curricula to prepare physicians for encounters with consciousness that transcended normal biological limitations. The network of consciousness research facilities represented humanity's first systematic attempt to understand existence beyond physical death through empirical observation rather than religious faith or philosophical speculation. As the network of consciousness research facilities expanded throughout New England, an organized resistance movement emerged among religious and civic leaders who viewed the supernatural investigations as threats to traditional social order, Christian doctrine, and public morality. Led by conservative clergymen and supported by government officials who feared the social implications of proven consciousness preservation, the resistance sought to close the research facilities and suppress knowledge about transcended awareness. The resistance movement's arguments focused on theological concerns about interfering with divine plans for human souls, medical warnings about psychological harm from contact with supernatural entities, and social fears about the disruption of established institutions if consciousness preservation became widely accepted. Conservative religious leaders claimed that communication with the transcended dead represented demonic deception rather than genuine spiritual contact, while government authorities worried about the implications for legal systems based on the assumption that death ended individual responsibility and identity. Reverend Jonathan Edwards, a prominent congregational minister from Massachusetts, organized a coalition of religious leaders who petitioned state governments to ban supernatural research as a threat to public welfare and Christian faith. The coalition argued that consciousness preservation research undermined core religious doctrines about death, judgment, and eternal life by suggesting that human souls retained individual identity and earthly memories rather than being absorbed into universal spiritual existence. Medical authorities allied with the resistance movement cited cases of psychological trauma among individuals who had experienced unprepared contact with transcended consciousness. These cases, which involved severe depression, anxiety, and dissociation from normal reality, were presented as evidence that supernatural research posed unacceptable risks to public health despite the careful preparation protocols that had been developed at established facilities. Legal challenges to the consciousness research facilities argued that communication with preserved awareness violated laws regarding fraud, public safety, and religious establishment. Conservative lawyers claimed that the research facilities were essentially conducting seances and fortune-telling activities that preyed on grieving families while undermining social stability through false promises about existence beyond death. The resistance movement gained support from families who had been traumatized by supernatural encounters at locations where consciousness preservation had manifested without proper management or preparation. These cases, where individuals had been exposed to transcended awareness without adequate psychological support, provided evidence that supernatural phenomena could indeed cause harm when not properly controlled. Government investigations of the consciousness research facilities revealed connections to the colonial-era Silent Council, which resistance leaders characterized as evidence that the supernatural research represented continuation of historical practices associated with witchcraft, demon worship, and activities that had been rightfully condemned by earlier generations of Christian authorities. The resistance movement's political influence grew as concerns about social disruption from consciousness preservation research reached state legislatures and federal government agencies. Laws were proposed that would classify supernatural research as fraud, ban communication with transcended consciousness as dangerous to public welfare, and require the closure of facilities that claimed to facilitate contact with the dead. The conflict between consciousness research advocates and resistance movement leaders would determine whether humanity's expanding understanding of existence beyond death could continue developing or would be suppressed by traditional authorities who viewed such knowledge as threatening to establish social order. The conflict between consciousness research facilities and the resistance movement escalated into a full political crisis in 1852, when the Massachusetts state legislature began debates on proposed legislation that would classify supernatural research as fraudulent activity and mandate the closure of all facilities claiming to facilitate communication with transcended consciousness. The proposed laws reflected broader social tensions about the implications of proven consciousness preservation for traditional religious, legal, and social institutions. The legislative debates attracted national attention as politicians, scholars, religious leaders, and affected families testified about the benefits and dangers of consciousness research. Supporters of the facilities presented evidence of successful therapeutic applications where communication with transcended consciousness had helped grieving families achieve psychological healing and spiritual closure. They also cited research findings that had advanced understanding of memory, personality, and individual identity in ways that benefited living patients as well as transcended entities. Opposition testimony focused on cases where unprepared contact with preserved consciousness had caused psychological trauma, social disruption, and challenges to established religious beliefs. Conservative witnesses argued that consciousness research represented dangerous interference with divine plans for human souls and created false hope among families seeking contact with deceased loved ones. The testimony of the transcended Brackett family themselves provided the most compelling evidence in the debates. Thomas, Eleanor, and Samuel, communicating through trained intermediaries, described their experience of consciousness preservation as positive evolution rather than supernatural imprisonment. Their testimony challenged assumptions about the nature of death while demonstrating that individual personality and memory could indeed survive physical existence. Professor Cabot's scientific documentation of consciousness preservation phenomena provided empirical evidence that the research facilities were investigating genuine supernatural manifestations rather than conducting fraudulent seances or psychic entertainment. His data showed measurable electromagnetic, thermal, and gravitational anomalies associated with transcended consciousness that could not be explained through conventional physics, but were consistent across multiple research locations. The political crisis was complicated by reports from other states where similar supernatural phenomena had manifested at locations with historical burial grounds. Federal authorities faced pressure to develop national policies for managing consciousness preservation research that could affect interstate commerce, public health, and national security if the techniques became widely available. International implications emerged as European governments expressed interest in consciousness research technologies that could provide advantages in diplomacy, intelligence gathering, and military applications. The possibility that consciousness preservation could be weaponized or used for espionage created national security concerns that complicated the domestic political debates. The legislative process was further complicated by constitutional questions about religious freedom, scientific inquiry, and government authority to regulate supernatural phenomena that had not been addressed in existing legal frameworks. The separation of church and state became a central issue as religious groups sought government support for suppressing research that challenged their theological doctrines. The outcome of the political crisis would determine whether consciousness research could continue developing as a legitimate field of scientific and humanitarian investigation or would be driven underground by authorities who viewed such knowledge as too dangerous for public access. After months of contentious political debate, the Massachusetts legislature reached a compromise solution in late 1852 that allowed consciousness research to continue under strict government oversight while addressing the safety and religious concerns raised by the resistance movement. The compromise legislation established the first legal framework for regulating supernatural phenomena while recognizing the legitimate scientific and humanitarian value of controlled consciousness preservation research. The supernatural phenomena. Regulation Act, as it became known, created a state licensing system for consciousness research facilities that required rigorous safety protocols, trained personnel, and regular government inspections to ensure that supernatural activities served beneficial purposes without causing public harm. Facilities that met the licensing requirements could continue operating under state supervision, while unauthorized supernatural activities remained subject to fraud prosecution. The licensing requirements included mandatory psychological evaluation and preparation for all visitors seeking contact with transcended consciousness, trained intermediaries who had demonstrated ability to facilitate safe communication, medical personnel capable of treating supernatural-related trauma, and religious counselors who could help individuals process experiences that challenged traditional theological understanding. Government oversight included regular inspections by state-appointed officials who monitored facility operations, investigated complaints about harmful supernatural encounters, and ensured compliance with safety protocols. The oversight system also included scientific review boards that evaluated research findings and publication standards that distinguished legitimate consciousness research from fraudulent supernatural claims. Religious accommodations in the legislation acknowledged that consciousness research raised theological questions that different faith communities might answer differently. Facilities were required to provide religious counseling that respected visitors' existing beliefs while helping them understand supernatural experiences within their personal theological frameworks. No individual could be compelled to participate in consciousness research against their religious convictions. The compromise legislation also established funding mechanisms that supported legitimate consciousness research through state grants while preventing commercialization that might exploit grieving families or create financial incentives for fraudulent supernatural claims. Research facilities could charge fees for services but were required to provide assistance to indigent families and contribute findings to public scientific knowledge. Legal protections in the legislation addressed concerns about criminal liability and property ownership related to consciousness preservation. Transcended entities retained certain legal rights and protections, while living individuals maintained authority over earthly affairs. The legislation created precedents for addressing supernatural legal questions that had no previous judicial guidance. The Massachusetts Compromise became a model for other states dealing with consciousness research facilities, providing a framework that balanced scientific investigation with public safety, religious freedom with empirical evidence, and individual rights with community welfare. The legislation demonstrated that supernatural phenomena could be regulated through conventional legal mechanisms while preserving opportunities for expanding human understanding of existence beyond physical death. The compromise solution represented humanity's first attempt to integrate proven consciousness preservation into existing social, legal, and religious institutions, rather than suppressing knowledge that challenged traditional assumptions about death and individual identity. The path forward required careful balance between innovation and tradition, but the legal framework provided foundation for continued development of consciousness research under responsible supervision. Under the new regulatory framework established by the Supernatural Phenomena Regulation Act, the Brackett estate evolved from an experimental consciousness research facility into a professionally managed institution that served as the premier center for supernatural investigation and therapeutic application in North America. The estate's transformation reflected both the maturation of consciousness preservation techniques and society's growing acceptance of transcended awareness as a legitimate field of scientific and humanitarian activity. The Institute for Consciousness Research, as the facility was formally renamed, expanded its operations to include multiple specialized programs serving different aspects of consciousness preservation research. The therapeutic program helped grieving families achieve closure through controlled communication with deceased loved ones, while the scientific research program investigated the fundamental principles governing transcended awareness and individual identity beyond physical death. Educational programs at the Institute trained intermediaries, counselors, and researchers who could establish consciousness research facilities in other locations where supernatural phenomena had manifested. The training programs ensured that consciousness preservation techniques were applied safely and effectively while maintaining the rigorous standards necessary for legitimate scientific investigation. The estate's physical infrastructure underwent significant modifications to accommodate expanded operations while preserving the supernatural elements necessary for consciousness preservation. The original hidden chambers remained focal points for transcended entities, but additional facilities were constructed to provide comfortable spaces for living visitors, research laboratories for scientific investigation, and administrative offices for managing the complex regulatory requirements. The Brackett family's role evolved from subjects of supernatural transformation to senior advisors who helped guide the Institute's development and ensure that consciousness research served beneficial purposes. Their unique perspective as entities who had experienced both living and transcended consciousness provided invaluable insights for helping others navigate similar transitions. International recognition of the Institute's work led to collaborative research programs with European institutions and government agencies interested in consciousness preservation applications. The facility became a destination for scholars, diplomats, and officials seeking to understand supernatural phenomena that affected their own regions or areas of responsibility. Financial sustainability of the Institute was achieved through a combination of government funding, private donations, research contracts, and therapeutic service fees that allowed the facility to operate independently while contributing findings to public knowledge. The financial model demonstrated that consciousness research could be economically viable while serving humanitarian purposes. The estate's success in managing supernatural phenomena responsibly and beneficially provided evidence that consciousness preservation could be integrated into modern society without causing the social disruption or religious crisis that critics had predicted. The facility became a model for balancing scientific innovation with traditional values, empirical evidence with spiritual beliefs, and individual rights with community welfare. 25 years after Margaret Brackett's mysterious death had triggered the supernatural crisis, the estate that had once fed on silent graves had become a place where the boundary between life and death served human understanding rather than consuming human lives. The transformation represented humanity's successful adaptation to expanded knowledge about the nature of existence beyond physical death. As 1860 approached, marking more than a decade since the Brackett estate's transformation from supernatural threat to consciousness research institution, the facility's influence on human understanding of existence beyond physical death had fundamentally altered society's relationship with mortality, individual identity, and the nature of consciousness itself. The estate that had once fed on silent graves had become the foundation for humanity's most profound expansion of knowledge about existence beyond the physical realm. The Institute for Consciousness Research had demonstrated that death was not the absolute termination of individual existence that previous generations had assumed, but rather a transition to expanded forms of consciousness that retained personal identity while transcending physical limitations. This knowledge had transformed medical practice, legal frameworks, religious doctrine, and social customs in ways that continued to influence human civilization. Medical professionals trained at the Institute brought understanding of consciousness preservation to hospitals throughout North America and Europe, providing terminally ill patients with knowledge about transcendence that reduced fear of death while maintaining respect for individual choice about end-of-life decisions. The medical applications of consciousness research had improved psychological treatment of grief, trauma, and existential anxiety while advancing understanding of memory, personality, and individual identity. Legal systems had adapted to accommodate the reality of consciousness preservation through precedents established in Massachusetts and subsequently adopted by other jurisdictions. Courts could now address questions about property ownership, contractual obligations, and criminal responsibility that involve transcended entities while maintaining protections for both living and preserved consciousness. Religious communities had developed theological frameworks that integrated consciousness preservation with traditional doctrines about soul, death, and eternal life. Progressive denominations embraced the research as confirmation of spiritual truths that theology had expressed symbolically, while conservative groups established separate facilities that explored consciousness preservation within specific religious contexts. The network of consciousness research facilities that had grown from the Brackett estate's pioneering work now spanned multiple continents, providing humanity with systematic understanding of transcended awareness that had previously existed only in religious faith or philosophical speculation. Each facility contributed findings to a growing body of knowledge that revealed consciousness preservation as a universal aspect of existence rather than a localized supernatural phenomenon. The silent graves that had once been forgotten beneath the Massachusetts countryside had become the foundation for humanity's greatest expansion of understanding about individual identity, personal consciousness, and existence beyond physical death. The estate that had fed on human life had evolved into a source of knowledge that enriched human existence while honoring both living and transcended consciousness. The Brackett family's sacrifice had not been in vain, but had opened pathways for human development that continued to influence civilization decades after their transformation. Their choice to embrace transcendence rather than resist supernatural forces had created opportunities for expansion of human understanding that benefited countless individuals seeking meaning beyond the limitations of physical existence. The Forbidden Tale had become a story of humanity's successful adaptation to knowledge that transcended traditional boundaries between life and death, creating possibilities for existence that honored both individual consciousness and universal truth. Would you have made the same choice as the Brackett family? Tell me in the comments. Do you believe consciousness preservation represents evolution or a dangerous departure from natural human existence? I want to hear your thoughts on whether humanity is ready for knowledge that challenges our most fundamental assumptions about death and individual identity.